Greetings, another in the series of podcasts on craft beer finance. This one is going to deal with the concept of internal rate of return, which kind of builds upon the payback and net present value concepts we talked about in the previous couple of sessions. Internal rate of return is a really popular metric to help investors and management evaluate what's the annual return on my investment for a particular investment, say in a machine, a company, whatever. Internal rate of return, or IRR as it's known, is really a corollary to net present value. What it really does is it just simply takes the forecast that you did for your net present value, the 3 or 5 year forecast, and you substitute in different discount rates and try to find out what discount rate or rate of return is the one that gives you a zero net present value. And this is what we call an iterative process, which basically is trial and error. And what it does is when you get this discount rate that gives you the zero net present value, that's your internal rate of return. In other words, what's the average annual return on your investment for that particular capital budgeting project. Now, the typical like net present value, internal rate of return has a decision rule. If the IRR in a project is equal to or higher than your company's weighted average cost of capital or the discount rate you used in your net present value calculation, then it's financially acceptable, and vice versa. If it's less than that, then you reject it. Namely, what this a positive IRR greater than your cost of capital is also going to be consistent with a positive net present value, and vice versa. Now, if you remember back to that table of those 6 different projects, there was a project E that we looked at. If you recall, the cash flows for project E where we spent $20,000 at the beginning in year 0, the company generated $6,000, or the investment we estimated would generate $6,000 in the first 3 years, and then $20,000 in year 4 and nothing beyond. So to estimate or to determine the internal rate of return, we'll plug in a different discount rate between 0 to X% where we see the IRR function. Then that will calculate a present value factor for each year, and then we'll be able to determine the net present value. So for instance, if we threw in a discount rate of 20% for each of the cash flows, the positive cash flows 1 through 4, you can see the associated discount factors and also the present value associated with it. When we convert all the cash inflows from the future into present values, add them all up, you can see the present value of the inflows is $22,276, which compared to the $20,000 outflow in the beginning would give us a positive net present value of $2,276. Well, we know we want to find that discount rate that gets us to 0 net present value, whereas this one is positive 2276. So we know that it's either got to be higher or lower than what we're currently using. Well, we know the present value is positive, so to get to a 0 net present value, we have to trial some higher discount rates. So what happens if we use a discount rate of 24%? You can see that the present value of the inflows reduces from 22,276 down to 20,340, yet still positive by $340 when we compare it to the $20,000 outflow in the beginning of the project. So we know that we're getting close to the internal rate of return. If we trial 26%, then we get a positive value of the inflows of 19,484. So we know that somewhere in between, that the discount rate has to be between 24 and 26. And probably you can guess that it's halfway, it'll be 25%. So this project will have an internal rate of return of 25%. Now, if we were to compare that to our previous example in the previous podcast of a discount rate where we used a 15% discount rate to get to a net present value, we'd say this project has an IRR of 25%. The discount rate we used for the company previously was 15, so the IRR is greater than our company discount rate. So therefore, we would accept the project. So you can go through and do the same exercise for all 6 of the projects, A through F, and in doing so, you can develop an internal rate of return for each one. As you can see, E is 25%, B 22, C, which had the greatest amount of cash flows in the forecast, had a higher IRR than any of them, and only A had a negative or a zero internal rate of return, and that coincided also that it had a negative net present value. So then we can list the IRRs for each of the projects, and if we used a benchmark of 15% for our net present value discount rate, we'd see that all the projects B through F would be financially acceptable, and only A would be rejected, which is very consistent with the net present value. And then if we rank the projects based upon the highest to lowest internal rate of return, you can see C would be at 52%, all the way down to and be the number 1 ranked, all the way down to A at 0% or negative, and a number 6 IRR rank. Again, consistent with NPV. So typically, internal rate of return decision rule is going to give us the same outcome as net present value. But I do want to make you aware of a couple weaknesses in internal rate of return that in special cases might lead to inconsistent decisions. The first weakness of one of the first weaknesses of internal rate of return is what we call the multiple rate of return issue. What that means typically is when the future years, for in this case, in the later years, like in this example, year 2, when you start with a negative cash outflow, the investment, and then you lose money in later years, you can end up with 2 different internal rates of return. So here you can see we spend $100,000 in year 0. We have a cash inflow of $230 in 1, but we lose $132 in year 2. Well, if we were to trial and error different discount rates, if we use 20%, that would give us a 0 net present value in this example. In other words, 20% internal rate of return. However, if we also were to put in a discount rate of 10%, we'd get the same result. So in the few cases where you have negative cash inflows or negative cash flows in later years, where it's positive, then negative, and maybe positive, or some kind of version of that, you can get 2 different internal rates of return. So you have to be aware of that issue. There are ways to compensate for that we'll talk about on our next podcast. Another weakness of internal rate of return is if you solely rely upon that for your decision making, is that it tends to favor smaller dollar investment projects versus larger dollar ones, even if the larger dollar investment project creates a larger net present value. Here's an example where we just look at 2 different potential investments, a small budget and large budget item. The small budget, we're going to invest $10 million. The larger, $25 million at the beginning. And we just assume that it goes out, it's just a 1-year project and a 1-year return. The small budget, we get $40 million back in year 1. The large budget, we get $65 million back. Well, if we solely relied upon internal rate of return, the smaller budget item, 300%, is much greater than the other at only 160%. So if we had to choose one versus the other, we would take the small budget item. However, you can see that the large budget item, despite the smaller internal rate of return, has a larger net present value in a dollar value calculation. And in a company's case where we want to look at maybe our goal is to maximize dollar value or create value, we might be more inclined to choose the large budget item. So what we like to encourage people to do is use both IRR and net present value to help you have both numbers to be able to help you make your decision. So in summary, internal rate of return is a really effective tool. It's used by many venture capitalists. It's used by many bankers. It's used in management and companies doing capital budget decisions. It gives you a it gives you a different, instead of giving a dollar value, but using net present value, it gives people an X summary of what's the percentage return on this particular investment. And for a lot of people, that makes more intuitive sense. Um, Recall the weaknesses, the multiple rates of return, also the favoritism towards smaller budget items, but still use it along with payback and use it with net present value because they're still very common tools in the capital budget process. So we always recommend at a minimum use net present value along with internal rate of return and use that to help you evaluate your financial decision making process.